Hello, all, and welcome to the ID Book Club. This is our first meeting. I'm so happy to have you here. If you have not heard or have not seen our replay from last week introducing the book club, don't have to check it out now, but do know that we are taking a look at the one and the only Map It with Cathy Moore. So if you don't already have your copy, no worries. It's all good. But if you do, let's pull that out. We're going to dig into it and get into chapter one, talk about the introduction pretty quickly. And speaking of introductions, I'm Nathan Wolfe. If you didn't meet me last week, I am the community manager here working with Devlin. I've been doing some things on the back end, but now I'm excited to be forward facing with you all and engage with you in this book club study. So it's not just me, it's going to be you up here on the stage with me, hopefully, after we do our brief recap. And I am looking forward to seeing all the awesome insights that we pull out from this book and what we can do with it. With action mapping, specifically Map It itself, yes, it's very action oriented. We will dig into those specific actionable tips, but I do find it interesting how Cathy Moore starts us off. So, as we recap, I didn't want to get too much into the introduction because it does give us a high level overview. But if you haven't read it, I suggest starting there too. But as we take a look at her introduction, I thought it was helpful, just sharing some of the few quotes that she threw out there in terms of what the overall goal of action mapping is. So, looking at what she said there, just on page 3, I thought this was a nice high level overview of what the goal of action mapping is, in contrast to some of the other info dumps that we will talk about here this morning, too. But she said, we're going to turn vague, they should know this type of training requests into projects that solve real, clearly defined performance problems. And that's really what action mapping is at its core, according to Cathy Moore, what we're going to seek to be able to do ourselves. And there's a lot of vagaries that we might run into, and she's going to discuss that further in chapter 1 as well. But it's not just about the goal of action mapping, which she'll outline in really 5 key phases. I don't want to say steps because there are a lot of intricacies there, and we'll get a little bit more granular and specific as we go throughout these chapters. She does also discuss what, not just what the goal is, but what's the outcome supposed to be when we look at action mapping. And this is also in the introduction, which I found helpful as well. This is our goal. This is where we want to get by the end of reading through this text, or if you've already read through it and been practicing yourself, I want to hear your shared outcomes here, where we're going to create less content and more memorable experiences, especially practice experiences where we see changed behavior and learning from that measurement rather than these knowledge checks that she's going to get into in a little bit too. So I do find it interesting that in order to really dig into those actionable tips, to see those changed behaviors, not just in the learners, but also in us as training designers, we don't start with just the facts and the do this or do that. It starts a little bit deeper. And if you didn't hear my background from last week, I am a former English teacher in the high school level. This is a different kind of text than what I might be going over usually, but Cathy Moore, one, let's just appreciate her for the fact that she gives she keeps it real, right? She gives us a very easy to follow read here in terms of her language. So that is awesome. But she also uses a little bit of foreshadowing because what she brings up in chapter 1 is something that underlies the rest of the action mapping process, where she's going to go, some of the anecdotal, fictionalized experiences she'll discuss in the text. And I think this is so crucially important. In fact, I want us to be able to talk about this a little bit later. And she starts with one thing, and that's culture. Looking at and questioning culture, because culture, actionable tips can't be actionable unless that mindset is fixed, unless there's something there's a shift within an organization, there's a shift within training designers to really get to the core of the problem. And that's going to be seen in multiple ways. Of course, she addresses this idea in the very beginning on page 10 in chapter 1. If you don't have your own copy, I know you're missing out. So I won't go through this exercise with you, but she starts asking us, are you infected? And I guess the question I thought was interesting, and we'll go back to this one a little bit later, is infected with what? Now, I do think this has to deal with culture and the cultural challenge faced with designing training, if training in that way is meant to be done in a certain scenario. But what are we infected with? She has a nice little exercise to go through. So if you have your own copy, I highly suggest doing that. But I want to go back to that question little later on. Maybe you can help me determine what that is. What are we infected with that's causing the problem? And I think part of it goes along with what she's saying that we need. We need a new mindset, and that knowledge isn't everything. And if you didn't read Cathy's imagery there on page 11 in Map It, talking about us being so obsessed with knowledge transfer, she goes on to give this picture of us floating high above the clouds. That's where the knowledge is, right? That's all in our minds, and we just want to throw down that intelligence on others. And that's quite literally the info dumping, but really that raining down on other people, that's not going to be successful, being up there in the cloud, where we need to come much more down to earth. And thankfully Cathy gives us those tips to get there. But knowledge isn't everything. It's part of the process, but it's not everything, right? We do maybe have an unhealthy relationship and obsession with knowledge transfer. But here's where this hit me the hardest. And I don't know about you, and I'm not quite sure where our audience is, but as a former teacher myself, I was little ready to be defensive here as Cathy Moore talks to us about really the harsh reality of things. So as we're reading through, if you didn't pick up on her language talking about the school model, she seems to suggest that's where the source of some of this infection has taken place, because the school model, as she suggests, is that we present information and create tests about it, and that's what teachers do. And so you might get really defensive, because if you were a former teacher or you've been in scenarios where you may fall into these traps, well, you're saying, no, that's not me. That's not what all teachers do. And I certainly know that in my experience, I try not to just teach to the test. I try not to design lessons that were only leading to the objective of answering a question right or wrong, that knowledge transfer idea. But that doesn't mean that's not the harsh reality. Because to be fair, the the learners, the trainees, the employees that we may be working with, trying to train and get to those behavioral changes, they've been inculcated with this school model, whether we like it or not. That's just the harsh reality. You may have not subscribed to that type of training, that type of mindset. But that doesn't mean that others haven't been experienced that themselves, right? They haven't gone through that process of having information shoved their way where their main goal is to get answers correct on the test. That's you know it's really hard not to get defensive there if you have been in that situation. But school model doesn't mean that that's what teachers do. That just means that's kind of the cultural problem, as we're talking about this culture in question, that really needs to be fixed and solved. That's what's at the infection. That's at the root of some of these issues there. So I want to hear from your experiences in a little bit to see if that's your feelings toward this as well. But I've been encouraged by the fact that it's not teachers that are the problem. It's that school model. If you subscribe to that, that's causing the issue. And so when it comes down to it, that issue she goes on to talk about really comes about because of one thing: that school model so entrenched in whether that's in a higher level of business or even in education itself, it's so pervasive, but why? Why does it continue? Why haven't we stopped with that? Why are we still being, some people, subjected to these info dumps types of training? And I think Cathy Moore brings a really good point, because she essentially says it's because we're not questioning assumptions. And that's such a direct challenge to us as those trying to design these learning experiences, is, are we constantly questioning assumptions? Because if you look at some of the scenarios, and again, that's the upside of having this text in front of you. If you've read through chapter 1, you saw all sorts of scenarios presented there where individuals are asked to create training, but really it's just regurgitate this information, transfer that knowledge, and we say yes because we don't question assumptions. And that gets to be part of that problem, right? And as we're thinking about that school model, it's not as if that is something completely foreign to a corporate or a business world. No, our tests, instead of teaching toward a test, now we're just calling them knowledge checks. It's the same thing, as Cathy Moore brings up. The knowledge checks, they're necessary components, but that's not all there is. That's not the job, as she goes on to say. That's not what your job is all about, or I would assume it's not about memorizing facts, but it's the same as the school model we might see there. We see instead, we should be questioning assumptions, not just that the goal is the knowledge check, but that decisions come before knowing, right? Decision making, application, that all ends up being a really key focus there. Like if you're looking in the text yourself on like page 14, Cathy really digs into this. Is, when we have knowledge, that's great. But the goal of training is to skillfully apply that knowledge, to make good decisions on the job. And that makes sense. And as we take a look at that, she gives this really great example. And I'd love to hear if you have any examples too, on using vague language. She gives the example of saying, oh, well, we can have that objective of use empathy. And using empathy would be great. Being nice to each other would be great, as she gives that example as well. But what does that look like? How do we see that in application? Again, that's just using that vague terminology that might not be seen in direct actions or decision making that we want to bring out there in that training. In fact, that's really what she goes on to talk about later, is like, meet learners where they're at. Question assumptions that everybody needs the exact same training. And this is where I think a lot of the problem comes into play too, where that school model so inculcated in those creating the training, but also those going through the training themselves, is we need to meet learners where they're at. She goes into a pretty long discussion on comparing the school model, where you have children who are generally blank slates and need that guidance. Now, that's not to say all of us have perfect knowledge. We do need some knowledge transfer to get to the point we need to be at, but meet people where they're at. There was a great line in there where we Cathy focuses on the fact that, if we feel like information is all that we have, we feel the need to preserve it, to keep it, to keep the exact package exactly how we want it presented, that everybody equally needs to be exposed. But what if they already have some of that knowledge? What if they've already been trained to a degree? Do we just start them over in that process? Well, that creates dry info dump type training that doesn't really succeed in changed behaviors, right? And so she kind of argues, like, let's not treat these adults like children. Let's let them, or trust them to choose what they do need to know, but more importantly, what they need to know in order to do that job better and behave in a different way. That, I thought that point was so helpful and needed, but that's a hard thing to let go of when you're designing training, is do we trust our audience to make those decisions to know what they need to create that behavioral change? And really, I think from looking at culture and questioning that, questioning the assumptions that are already there embedded within that culture, the assumptions that we may make, not just as those dealing with SMEs or those higher up who are asking for a certain training to be created, but even our us as instructional designers, we have to question those assumptions. But really, the big question overall comes down to one thing, and that is, what is the goal? And I pulled out some helpful quotes here because what is the goal of training if that is to be the solution? Of course, she goes on to say that a course is rarely the solution. If you've heard Cathy Moore speak in any of our Q&As that we've had here, or just a couple weeks ago, all about her own experiences with infodumps, she harped on the idea that courses aren't the answer to everything. In fact, actually, the focus probably needs to be more so to change behavior. Right? That's the goal. That's the solution. And just from focus of action mapping, action is in that term, of course, and so action is going to be seen through practice, trying to cement these new habits we're creating in those learners to really change the behavior, because then that shows a knowledge applied, right? And I really do love how she talks about not just practice and not just breaking bad habits or old habits, but spaced practice. And we're going to see that as she goes throughout the book, giving us those phases of action mapping and what the goal is and how we get there. And it's not just a one-off training webinar solution. That defeats the purpose too. It's that space practice to get to that behavioral change. And we question assumptions. We meet people where they're at. That seems to be the focus of chapter 1. But that hasn't necessarily given us completely actionable tips. But that's okay, because this is at the root, this is at the core of what Cathy Moore is leading us in, to get to that point where we can now use action mapping to meet that goal, meet that need, if training is necessary. But of course, more importantly, to change that behavior to see on-the-job performance, not just tests, not just knowledge checks, but more importantly, those changed habits to have a more efficient business. But I do want to talk about actionable steps, because here is where we are at, where we're going. I was just trying to give a quick recap. Hopefully that was helpful for you. Hopefully you saw some of the same things. But if you found new takeaways that I didn't even address, I want to be able to hear them. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to pose some questions, some thought questions, really looking at the key points that we've already discussed, considered. And I appreciate everyone's insights already in the chat. We want to be able to touch on those. Let's look at those thought questions. Here's what I had, first of all, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier, is what is the source of the infection and what might be the cure? I did find it interesting that Cathy never really specifically says what the infection is, although I think we've talked through it enough that we can piece that together pretty well. What is the source of the infection and what might be the cure? Head on over to that table if that seems to be an interesting conversation for you. Number 2, what assumptions have we failed to question? And do we often fall prey to, maybe in our own dealing with requests from SMEs or others and organizations? And then finally, one more time, what's that relationship? What do you think is that relationship between knowledge and changed behavior? So those are 3 questions that we'll take a look at for just a little bit. Let's discuss this. I will see you back on the main stage in just a little bit, and let's jump into those discussion group tables right now. I mean, I'll be honest, chapter 1 is not that long, but there's so much there to dig into that I want to be able to hear your insights and see what you talked about in your discussion tables. Now, I noticed not too many of us jump straight into that first one. And that could be for a couple different reasons. I do think it's a little bit of an analogy, right, that we have to follow with the infection versus cure. But I'll still throw that out there. If there are those who wanted to share, you should be able to down below here underneath my face, there should be an option for you to like raise your hand and I can invite you to the stage. If you had insights to share, check that out. And be careful because if you raise your hand, I'm going to click on you and invite you up here. So we'll talk for a couple minutes. And then when you feel like you've shared that, we maybe had a back and forth, then we'll have others jump on up here as well. So thanks for already being willing to share. So Liv, you want to head on up here?
Hello, everyone.
Hi there.
Hi.
So what
Uh,
do you think that source of infection is?
so my partner and I talked about just formal education. As a teacher, there's just so much content you have from the curriculum that you have to go through, and that's how you're measured on for years and years and years. And so you have a content focus. And also from a higher education perspective, where I come from, there was a time where knowledge was rare and precious and valuable and
Mhm.
hard to come by. And students would come into the lecture hall to hear the one person at the front of the room with the one book, Darwin's Origin of the Species, just read from that book because that was the only in the whole country. That's where that one book
Yeah,
existed, and that's the only way of getting that knowledge. And
yeah.
we are coming from that system from 1600 Germany, and we have inherited it, and we continue to value knowledge in that way, and we forget all the assumptions
Mhm.
behind what motivates a person to acquire, use, explore, and expand the knowledge.
Yeah. I think you're exactly right, Liv. And that's what Cathy Moore is getting at with that school model, right? And I saw in the chat too, some of us were talking about like former teachers. I was a former IB teacher too. And we focus on that inquiry based kind of focus there where it's on the students to question and learners to question and be involved in that learning. But that's definitely not the norm. And that's definitely not historically, as you just talked about. Like, yeah, that's the old school model. That's probably where the problem starts, right? At the very least, like embedded in our minds. Yeah, I totally agree with you there, Liv. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, so it really does lie and is embedded in that the really historical way of containing being knowledge keepers, right? But that's not our goal as instructional designers, or it should not be, right? Especially according to Cathy Moore's perspective. And some are saying in the chat that maybe there's no no cure. It's not a easy. Let's find one solution that fits all. But maybe I like that Noah. Let's put there in the chat. It's a continuous battle to improve the process. No, I think that's fair though. I think that's fair. Any others want to share out on that source of infection there before we move on to the next one? Or is there a cure? Hey, head on up here, Courtney. Go for it.
Hi. So, the source of infection, of course, like many of us already have mentioned,
Mhm.
is of course a school model.
Yeah.
But I do have like a question
Hmm.
when we're thinking about knowledge and performance. Can you not like kill two birds with one stone by, of course, having when you performing doing something performing, you are also gaining knowledge as well, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. So basically, when you combine those two, you don't have to really just necessarily focus on one.
Hmm.
Basically, you can put performance and knowledge in the same category and go for it at the same time. So,
And I think that's totally the key to, or part of the solutions that we're going to see with action mapping too. So very valid points there, Courtney. And maybe some of you talked about that in the other discussion table on that relationship between knowledge and like changed behavior. The performance is what we're trying to fix, but knowledge has to play a part in that too. And I think you're totally right there. But we can't have knowledge be the end all be all, as Cathy is saying. We can't be so obsessed with that transfer. Maybe that's the infection, is not so much the knowledge, it's just what emphasis are we placing on it. Yeah. Very nice. Thanks for sharing. Why don't we move on to that other question and consider a little bit more so, what assumptions have we failed to question? This is the harsh reality and honest truth that we have to face, because maybe you've gone through that experience as well. Maybe you've had certain assumptions that have been really hard to overcome within an organization. What was the essence of our discussion group tables here? Linda, you want to help us out? Head on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nathan. An assumption is that I was kind of sharing with the group is it's very possible that a stakeholder hears some anecdotal feedback from
Mhm.
their audience, right? A couple people here, maybe a couple people there, or maybe it's just two people out of an audience of it doesn't matter how big, right? It could be like
Mhm.
100, it could be 1,000, and they just think that that applies to their entire audience.
Yes.
That's a potential, right?
Mhm.
So I have a project request right now where the stakeholder says, well, if everybody uses this template, then we can, we have this great template. And if in the process of filling out the template, a lot of people who are requesting help will be able to solve their problem just by being guided through, right, this
Mhm.
template
Mhm.
to request our help or my team's help,
Mhm.
their team's help. But anyway, so and I just thought, do you even like it's not like you track, oh, I started to fill out the template, but then I didn't need it because you helped me and I solved
Mhm.
my own problem, right? So there's no measurement, there's no way to measure, right? Because that's
Mhm.
not a metric that they're going to start measuring. I went down the line of questioning a lot, and I mentioned it in the chat. It's like how many, how often, and just try to get a gauge of what the impact could be or how I could positively help them. And
Mhm.
it was really hard. It was really hard. And I think in the end, and I haven't fully decided yet, but it's just, here's the knowledge. If you are already aware of this, then you can opt out of it,
Mhm.
basically. And if you don't know anything about it, then, you should take this course or be aware of these documents that you can look up later on. So
Mhm.
anyway, but the group shared ideas about how to kind of gauge that level of that assumption just to be able to measure it, right? Whether it's focus groups to talk to people about it. I mean, surveys, things like that. I mean, in my case, it's really hard to be able to do those things because it all takes time. I can't and my audience is under pretty heavy time constraints
Mhm.
and are client facing. So anyway, that's what we talked about.
I think that's a fantastic illustration just of, meeting learners where they're at too. Like it's not all catch all. It's not just one size fits all anything. I think that goes directly to that point where we need to trust them. But yeah, that's interesting. Do you have any other ways with that method you were talking about of like tracking anything in terms of metrics, or was that just like the main kind of failure that wasn't questioned there that you noticed?
Yeah, I'm really lucky in that I work for an organization that loves data. They love data. So we know how many people fill out this template. We know how many instances of where there was an easy answer
Mhm.
to be able to help that person.
Mhm.
So I mean, there's certainly data there to use, but as far as what this person was hoping for it to be used, or the change that they wanted to make, or the impact they wanted to have, I mean, there's just not. So I don't know. I think I could probably do some more digging with them
Mhm.
and figure it out because I don't know all of the data points. I don't
Mhm.
know what else there could be. It was a 30-minute meeting, and so we didn't get to that level of detail. But yeah. Mhm.
Interesting, and I think we're gonna hopefully get some more actionable tips on that from Cathy too, as we look through that process. Like, where do we go from there if we know what that goal is? But thanks, Linda. Appreciate you sharing that. And yeah, those real life stories are kind of where it's at, right? That's the whole goal of all of this, and the goal of our book club here for us to hear from you. So let's look at that last question, because I did see there was a good handful of people at that table. Maybe we can share in that regard. And then we'll jump back into discussion tables and take the conversation further. But there we go. What kind of relationship is there between knowledge and that change behavior? And we've alluded to this a little bit already, but what were some of those insights your group came up with there? Examples, experiences you've had? Because this can be tricky. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but how do we acknowledge the role that knowledge and that change behavior might have working together? Allison, head on up here and let's hear it. Thanks for sharing. Oh,
Hey, sorry about that. It was a little bit of a delay.
you're
I
good.
think this is a really interesting question because I think this depends so much on the problem, right? Like sometimes that's one that I was saying, like I put a 1 next to this, even though I knew the answer was like to put as low a score on this as now, like it was gonna be like you're a little infected. But sometimes knowledge does change behavior because sometimes people actually don't know. Like sometimes the reason I'm doing something wrong is because I'm missing a piece of knowledge. I think that's where the action mapping comes in handy, and you're actually looking at like the analysis stage where you don't jump to solving the problem, where you first figure out that real like what is the source of the problem, and like is it motivational, is it environmental, is there a management structure in place that's causing this performance problem, or is it that people don't know this is where you put that thing, and that probably doesn't need a course, that probably needs a job aid. But I think that a lot of training problems that use job aids particularly can be solved with a knowledge, like our knowledge problems. But then I love the example she gives about like, okay, customer service, like here you go through the little scenario and now you're great at customer service. But the reality is there are 17 phones ringing, people are talking at you.
Yes.
It's not a real world thing. So that knowledge isn't cemented enough to create a behavioral change because you haven't had the practice. So it's like there's knowledge-based training, there's skills-based training, and skills-based training is often very lacking in actually creating the reality of the skills that you need. And that's why it's really hard to do in bulk when you have to.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that because it's so true, right? The practice is so necessary for any kind of behavioral change. And it's not just that, like we mentioned before, like we need that spaced practice, like continual practice for those habits to change. But knowledge has a role, and she'll get onto that later down the line, like where we take those facts or those concepts or whatever specifics there are, we infuse those into activities and that practice. But it should take maybe more of a subordinate role. And I like how you started off too. Like, well, you ask the questions: what's the problem? What's the goal? Goals of behavior change. Yeah, exactly right, Allison. Appreciate you sharing. All right, so as we're getting closer down to the end of our time there, any others who want to jump in there? You all are great. I love just hearing from you all, learning from everybody and your experiences. Any others who want to jump up here and share any other insights or takeaways? Because I'll be honest, my questions were just based on my perception and my experience, which, as I told you all last week, we're approaching this from a novice perspective, and that's where I'm coming from. But any others with experience who've maybe seen some other helps or takeaways from that cultural challenge, chapter 1, as we're wrapping that up? All right, Judy, head on up here and wrap us up.
Hello. I am like completely new to instructional design, and so it was really, really cool to hear everyone's real world applications of the like map-it and action mapping in general. I was starting to read it before I heard about the book club, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know how this works. Like I just found everyone's comments in the chat and like sharing it and how you guided us through the first chapter. It was just like, I got a lot out of it, and I just wanted to say thanks to everyone. And then specifically just learning more about the dynamics that are involved in instructional design and your relationship with the client, and like how important it is to, even after knowing about action mapping, like actually applying it. It sounds like there's very specific ways that going about it would be more helpful if you phrase it a certain way and it didn't seem like you were being condescending or like ignoring what they're identifying the problem as. So
Mhm.
I thought that was cool, and I'm excited to read more. Yeah.
Love it. Love the excitement. And I appreciate you being here as well as everyone else, because this is what it's all about, right? Having us here to work through it. And I hope that we can get to more like application based. I don't know. Cathy's going to take us through several scenarios, and we'll get to share all about that. So thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for being here and helping us out with that. This is definitely a community effort, and I hope that you've enjoyed that. Now, before we go, I want to make sure that we know what's coming next. So, which you can probably guess what's coming next. We just read chapter 1. That means we need to move on to, that's right, chapter 2. So read chapter 2 for next week. We'll meet at the same time, same place. And I'll still have our tables open after this as well, so we can continue that conversation if you had other questions and discuss things further. I'm open to hearing suggestions as well, because I want this to be what we need as a group. But if you haven't already checked our Slack channel specifically for the ID book club there in Devlin Slack channel, check there for updates. Some of you have been commenting and just encouraging each other. I love it. That's what it's all about. This is all about us making sure we can hold each other accountable to get that reading done. We're taking it really slow initially. We'll pick up speed a little bit, and we'll have this book done and discussed and hopefully thoroughly implemented even in our own practice by June. But chapter 2 next week. Check those Slack for updates there. And thanks for those who showed up last evening at 5 p.m. Pacific time for that ID community reading hour. If you're not able to, this is for those in the replay, able to join us for these live sessions, please pop in on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time to meet with other people, form your own little study groups. You can always use this live community space to meet at any time you'd like to, as long as there's not main sessions going on, to discuss with others different chapters of Map It as we go on through. And I got to leave you with one last parting gift. And this is not for me. This is from Cathy Moore. And I love how she ended the chapter here. Don't view your job as knowledge transfer. It's much bigger than that, which may sound intimidating, but that's a good little motivational words of wisdom from Cathy Moore to leave us with. And I'll see you next Friday. Be ready for chapter 2. And thanks everyone again. Goodbye.